room. The reading room. The reading room. The reading room.
This is our 8th episode, and we are continuing with the James Bond movie franchise. We are rewatching the movies in order and then rating and ranking each movie. So this is episode 8, Live and Let Die.
So in this movie, James Bond is sent to New York City to investigate the mysterious deaths of several British agents. He senses there's a drugs link between the notorious Mr. Big and Dr. Kananga, who's an owner of a small Caribbean island. So Jay, what do you remember about the film before we rewatched it recently?
Yeah, so I think this is obviously Moore's first Bond movie. So I remember that it was, Roger Moore appearing in Bond for the first time. I remembered Solitaire, lovely Bond girl. I remember that she was in it. And I recall that there was quite a big boat chase as well. But other than that, I couldn't really remember much about the film. How about you, Andy?
So I remembered quite a bit from this. I remember the kind of the funeral / parade scenes in New Orleans at the beginning. I remember there was a lot of voodoo elements throughout the film. I remember the claw hand, the kind of metallic claw hand on Teehee. One of the villains, Baron Samedi, particularly the scene where he rises from the grave. That was really cool intro. I remember the scene with the crocodiles where he kind of uses them as stepping stones. And I remember Sergeant J.W. Pepper. I'm not going to do the proper accent, but he's a bit of a hillbilly cop that we see in a couple of films, I believe. And also there's a quite famous scene with Bond and Solitaire involving sharks and them being tied up and potentially fed to them, which I thought was pretty cool. So kind of scene specific rather than story specific, but there's quite a few memorable scenes in this film that I remembered beforehand.
Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? Like, in terms of the crocodile stepping stones. I don't know if it's the same with you, but when I'm going through rewatching these, there's certain things that I remember, but I can't quite place which film they're in. So, the crocodile scene is a famous scene, but I didn't realize it was in this movie. And same with J.W. Pepper. I recall that he appears in 2 Roger Moore films, but I couldn't recall it was this one. So, there's so many memorable scenes. Sometimes I just get a bit confused about which Bond film they actually appear. And I'm good at remembering that, oh, yeah, this is like a Roger Moore movie, but I can never quite place sometimes which movie it appears in.
Yeah, I agree. I have the same kind of thing. I think that for this film particularly, I have more vivid memories than some of the later ones, but you're right, I do the same thing. I did the same for some of the Connery ones as well. I knew that there were certain scenes that were from a Connery film, but I couldn't remember exactly what it was. And it's funny you mentioned that. I was actually just going off on a bit of a tangent. My dad this morning spoke to me, and I told him, rewatched this recently, and he went, "Oh, is that the one with the car jump?" I was like, "No, that's not." So he had the same kind of memories. Like, oh, I know that was a Roger Moore one, but he has the same kind of memory where he knows the elements of Connery and the elements of Moore, but not necessarily which film is which.
Yeah, and I know we're going to carry on in a minute, but I think as a kid, I think Roger Moore was the first Bond I saw on TV. I think he's the one, as when I think of my childhood, is the one that I associate more, even though he was 70s and 80s. Obviously, I was born in the early 80s. He's the one, I think, in terms of the first Bond, because I can't remember exactly which Bond movie I watched first, but I think he must have been the first Bond.
Yeah, I'm still more Connery. I remember Connery and I remember Moore, but Lazenby and Dalton, not so much. It's to be said, but in my head, before I kind of got into them properly and watched them all in order when I was a teenager, I didn't really know much about Lazenby or Dalton.
Yeah,
they were kind of the 2 kingpins. So let's continue on with our information gathering, and what we've got is a number of villains in this film. We've got Dr. Kananga, Mr. Big, we've got Teehee Johnson, and we've got Baron Samedi. Number of Bond girls in this: Solitaire, Rosie Carver, and Miss Caruso. And the theme song was by Paul McCartney and Wings, and the title Live and Let Die, as per the film.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So, yeah, continuing on the bits that we're collecting every movie, we've got the opening credits. And in terms of the notes, so got down very good music, very upbeat and fast paced, Andy, compared to the previous entries. The intro was very colourful as well. And I know they do this with each of the films, and obviously this has voodoo elements, but the move, you know, the opening credits has that influence of voodoo ceremonies. And also black models appearing. And I don't know, this is the first time they've had black models or not in the intro. I can't quite remember. And then you've just got your usual female silhouettes and models. So carrying on, we've got body count. So James Bond kills only. We've got 8 in this movie, and we can see where that drops in our rankings later on. And in terms of gadgets, we've got the Rolex watch. So this is a combination one. So you've got the spinning blade and the magnetic aspect of the watch as well. Moore's got a bug detector, also a transmitter as well. And what I've got down, Andy, here is a gas/air pellet. So I don't know whether you class it as a gas or air. So I've classed it as both for that particular gadget.
I'll go with gas/air because I'm not sure how you'd name that either. So for the purpose of this podcast, it is gas/air, which is very easy to say. So moving on to some other facts and figures, the introduction of James Bond. This was actually quite a while before we saw this in the film. It was 23 minutes and 10 seconds, which I believe is the longest it's taken so far when we have seen it. And we talked last week about when Connery came back to do Diamonds Are Forever, and he made the introduction very, very early on in the film, almost as if to remind the viewers that Bond is back and he is Bond. And they went the other way with this in terms of Roger Moore, and that kind of surprised me, especially with this being his first outing as Bond. I thought they might get that in a little bit earlier just to cement the fact, but yeah, over 23 minutes, which was a little bit surprising.
I had exactly the same thought, Andy, where I don't know how you do this, but I've got like a little pad and I pre-write certain things down that we're monitoring. And then, you know, me and the missus basically, you know, quickly pause it. And it was just going on. I thought maybe he doesn't say it because I thought, you know, Jules Lazenby said it quite early. Like you said, Diamonds Are Forever. Connery says it's nearly straight away. So, yeah, I was expecting Roger Moore to say it a lot earlier than the 23 minutes that you've just mentioned.
Also, some of the other staples of the Bond franchise, martini. No martinis for Roger Moore in this film. And there's no hats involved, either throwing or wearing. And I believe this is the first time that he's not wore a hat at any point in the film. So, Jay, what was your favourite scene from this film?
Yeah, I put down Crocodile Farm, Andy. I like the boat chase. I thought that was good. But for me, the Crocodile Farm, I thought was really good. It's quite a short scene actually when you think about it. You know, he gets there with T.H. Johnson and the other goons. He's taken on a little bridge that's wheeled out, and then he's there. And then you've got your mix of alligator and crocodiles. Throughout this movie, Roger Moore is very smooth and calm, and I think this is the only time that you see him a bit flustered, really. So I did enjoy that, and obviously we're going to touch on it later on. But you know, the stunt where he jumps over the crocodiles, I thought was really enjoyable. And we got some more information about that later on. How about you?
So I went for the boat chase. The Crocodile Farm scene is very, very good. There's a number of really good scenes in this, but for me, the boat chase just edged it. It's a little bit long when we think about other chases of cars or other vehicles in previous films, but it seemed to work, and the different elements of it I thought kind of bled together very, very well. Particularly liked the part where they crashed the wedding. That gave me a little chuckle. But yeah, the whole boat chase thing was kind of the thing I enjoyed the most. So, how many times did you reach for your phone?
I only reached for my phone once, and it was something to do with Roger Moore. Something happened in the movie, I can't remember what, and I ended up Googling it. But apart from that, you know, I enjoyed the film, so it did keep my attention. So, yeah, just the once. Disappointing, but it was once, and I had to be truthful. How about you, mate?
I didn't at all. I think this will be reflected in the rating in a moment, but I was really into this. That was very, very enjoyable film, and just kind of sat back and watched it. I mean, I took my usual notes, but I found myself at times thinking, "Oh, I've not taken notes for ages," because I was just I was engrossed. It kind of really sucked me in. So didn't need the phone for a good 2 hours at least.
That's good going.
So all important rating out of 10. Jay, what did you go with?
Yeah, so this, I think this surprised you, Andy. So I've given Live and Let Die 6 out of 10. So we're obviously going to go into more in-depth analysis later on when we do our rankings. But yeah, the rating I gave was 6 out of 10. Enjoyable film, but we can talk about the rankings a bit later on. How about you?
So this is where our synergy is broken, and I went for 8 out of 10. Really, really enjoyed this, and I was surprised that we were so different, because I mean, you've generally been a little bit more generous with your marks than I have over the past 7 films. But this for me was a fantastic opening film for more. So straight away 8 out of 10. That's what we think. How does your better half think?
Yeah, so the missus, she enjoyed this one. She said it was better than the recent films. She also liked Roger Moore, so she didn't think it was as sexist as Connery, as cold as Connery. So she really liked the stylish. And what she said was that Bond in this movie, and going on probably for the other Roger Moore films, that Bond came across as more of a British gentleman than a spy. So I think when you think about Connery, I think you think he's more of a killer, whereas Bond, he as Moore's version of Bond is more like a lover. He's obviously a gentleman and a spy, but that was her view. And like I said, she said it was very stylish. And when I was making notes on this, I just kept writing down that what Roger Moore was wearing was really stylish. And he just looked smooth and came across, and that was the missus' opinion as well. She enjoyed the film. She the last 3 films she hasn't really enjoyed, and I can't remember. I think it was the last one I said where she was like nodding off, but this one she really enjoyed it. So yeah, I bet you the wife's still not partaking.
She's still absent for these movies. I think I've not given up hope, but it's looking bleak at the minute. So I'm going solo for the foreseeable future.
That's fair enough. You've got me to keep you company, Andy.
Yeah, my podcast wife, as it were. A few other facts and figures about the film. So the runtime is 2 hours 1 minute. Again, we're in the same sort of ballpark as most of the others. We'll move later on to the kind of where that ranks, but it feels like it's about in the middle, about what we'd expect. This was released in 1973, a couple of years after Diamonds Are Forever. And Guy Hamilton is back at the helm, directing his 3rd Bond film, having previously directed Goldfinger and Diamonds Are Forever.
Yeah, and talking about Guy Hamilton, I think Goldfinger is obviously a very strong film that we've spoken about. Diamonds Are Forever. It was a box office success, but both of us didn't really think much of it. So he's come back for this one. Obviously, you've rated it highly, whereas I've said it's probably consistent, with and Diamonds Are Forever in our ranking. So yeah, it's interesting that it's come back for a 3rd time. So yeah, so now we're going to just talk about just some general points before we kind of get into scene by scene. So Andy, I like to talk about the box office stats as part of this podcast.
All about the money. All about the money.
Jerry Maguire, show me the money. So yeah, box office stats, Andy. So I thought this was surprising. So the budget for this was $7 million. So that budget is actually less than Diamonds Are Forever, on the Majesty's Secret Service, You Only Live Twice, and Thunderball. And we were talking about it last week, weren't we? That the budget you would imagine is going up each year because of like inflation, etc. But this is actually lower. than the previous four films, which I found really surprising. I don't know when when you're looking at this, whether you were surprised about that as well. But yeah, so in terms of box office returns, Andy, $162 million worldwide box office. So this was actually the most successful box office return for any of the 8 movies so far. So it kind of reinforces how you've done a high ranking as well. And I suppose I wonder if there's any correlation when there's a new Bond in terms of box office returns, whether it kind of goes up every time there's a new Bond or not. It might be something worth tracking. When someone's coming on, someone new, and they think, oh, go and see what he's like. And obviously Roger Moore, he was a successful TV star before this anyway, wasn't he? So he's probably got a lot of fans from his, TV work. So next point, Andy, was this is the first Bond movie to feature a black lover, so Rosie Carver. So I thought that was interesting, and obviously there's quite a lot of in terms of the settings and everything. There's quite a few black actors in this film, which I think is probably due to the time it was released. In the 70s, the movement at that point. And kind of following on from that point, really, is in the original movie script, Solitaire was actually supposed to be black. She was written as a black character, but United Artists, who's, the film studio, wouldn't actually sanction this. So that's why they ended up, obviously, giving the role to a white actress. And just before you kind of take over, Andy, the interracial relationship between Rosie and Bond caused issues across certain countries across the world, especially in places like South Africa. So I think it was quite a brave move by the director, the studio, and the screenwriter.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, in some ways we take those kind of things for granted these days. I mean, obviously we're not in a world of racial equality yet, but you would hope that things are heading in the right direction. So for this to be kind of seen as a big deal, I mean, we're talking nearly 50 years ago, so it may, you're absolutely right when you say it was quite a brave move, but it's something that now just wouldn't be given a second thought, I wouldn't think. So it's a testament to how times were versus how times are today. Let's move on a little bit further with some more information and facts. So this film actually doesn't have Q appear at all, which is interesting, because I was under the impression that he was basically in every one. But the producers thought that there was too much being made of the gadgets in the franchise, so there was no need for Q in this, which I thought was quite an interesting decision to not have him appear. But still, as you discussed earlier, there are still a number of gadgets in the movie, so almost contradictory points there, I would say. So Solitaire has tarot cards, and I noticed this a couple of times in the film, and I think this is quite a nice little Easter egg. But the design on the back of the card have 007 printed on them. So it's, on first glance, you would just see it look like any pack of tarot cards or any type of card, but as you look closely, you see the 007 logo kind of etched into the design, which I thought was quite a nice little touch. And the High Priestess was deliberately designed to resemble Jane Seymour, which I must admit I didn't particularly pay attention to, but that's a good find there, Jay. Final point from me on this is director Guy Hamilton liked the running over alligator stunt so much that he named the villain after the stuntman who performed it, Ross Kananga, who actually owned the alligator farm where the scene was filmed. That's a nice touch there. And I must admit, when I was reading through the notes and I saw a little bit later on where we talk about Ross Kananga, I did wonder whether you'd made a typo, but this obviously, kind of explains that. And I was thinking, has he made a mistake here? Kananga's not the stuntman; he's the villain. Turns out he's both. So that's a nice touch there.
Did you fact check my fact, Andy?
I did not. I saw that comment. I didn't obviously read the notes in order. I saw the later note first, and then as I scrolled back, I noticed that one. I was like, oh, okay, that explains it. But I trust your research.
Thank you. There's no fake news on this podcast, is there, Andy?
Not so far,
Only my quiz.
Well, I mean, that's more than fake news. That's an absolute travesty. But we'll move on to that later on.
So we mentioned in a previous episode that Lois Maxwell had asked for a pay rise to continue in the Bond franchise. So she obviously returned for Live and Let Die, but it turned out, Andy, that she returned for the same fee. They wouldn't actually give her a pay rise, but it did work out for her because the scene that she was in at the beginning, with Bond's house, there was actually some technical problems. So she had to do filming for an extra 2 days, so it meant actually she did get a pay rise in the end in a roundabout way. So it worked out well for Miss Moneypenny.
Hope she got time and a half for those.
Yeah, maybe more. I don't know. She got what she wanted. So she apparently bought some kind of new coat to celebrate her her extra bit of salary. So yeah, the next bit we're going to talk about is Goose and continuity error. So Andy's very good at picking these out. So I've got 3, Andy, and then I'm going to pass over to you to see what you've got. So at the beginning in San Monique, there's a bit where the bloke is holding the snake. And I don't know if you picked this up. I think it was so obvious. Where in the bits where the cameraman is behind the actor, the hand is actually on the snake's head pretty much, or near it. But then when the shots are taken in front of the actor, so you could see the bloke holding a snake, it's just obviously it's lower down the body's neck, snake's neck. And so I thought that was really obvious there. So I don't know if you picked up on that bit, Andy.
I did, yeah. It was blatant.
Yeah. So even my untrained eyes picked up that one. At the beginning as well, there's a bit where Bond goes into the taxi outside the voodoo shop, and you can see the film crew in the reflection of the car. And then a bit later on, we mentioned we mentioned cars and ramps in the previous one with flipping between 2 wheels. This isn't a 2-wheel situation, but you do see where there's a bit where the taxi goes up the stairs. But as it's doing it, you can actually see the ramp that they've made, where the taxi goes up and actually crashes into some bins, trash cans. As well. So they're the 3 that I kind of noticed. What about you?
So there was a bit later on where there's a female pilot. She stops the plane. Bond's talking to her, and you can see that the wings behind her are still intact. But earlier in the scene, they were ripped off in the plane chase. So obviously a bit of I don't know if that's just a continuity issue or whether they're just because they filmed those scenes out of order or edited them out of order. But that was a pretty big boo-boo. There's one where T.H. Johnson leaves Bond on the island in the pond. The first crocodile that climbs up changes between alligator and crocodile between shots. I must admit I didn't notice that myself. I think this is one of your finds, so well done on that. But for any animal lovers out there, I'm sure you would have noticed the difference between alligator and crocodiles. This one I found, and it's a little bit of a nitpicking one, but it's one that I was kind of looking for because I'm strange like that and I look for errors. But Bond and Solitaire are in bed together. Bond's wearing his watch, and it's around 10:10. And then they're having a little chat, and there's a couple of different camera angles used. And then seconds later, his watch says it's around 1:30. So I'm assuming that's because of the length of time it took to film that scene. But obviously, in terms of continuity, that's an error if you spot those sort of things. And the final one from me is around the car chase scene. So there's 4 police cars that crash at one time. And in the 4th car, you can clearly see that the driver's wearing a crash helmet. There was no attempt to kind of cover that up or hide that. So he's clearly a stunt driver, not a real policeman.
Safety first, Andy. And also when you mentioned about Bond and Solitaire in bed, I was surprised you picked that up, Andy, if I'm honest, because you're usually looking for nipple plasters or something when Bond is in bed with a Bond girl. So I was surprised you picked that one up.
I have no comment. I'm not saying that you're wrong, though.
Okay, so that's all the Goose and continuity ones that we kind of just wanted to highlight. So we're into the film now, Andy. So the famous gun barrel sequence. So this shot actually, the change. So we're obviously on to the eighth episode, and this is the fourth time that they've changed the gun barrel sequence. And also, this is the only time that this introduction gun barrel introduction sequence is used in this film. And then the next one, The Man with the Golden Gun. So they changed it again after 2 films of Roger Moore.
Yeah, that is interesting. And also, Roger Moore's wearing a business suit and he uses both hands. So when we think of the previous gun barrel sequence, the actors tend to hold the gun in their right hand and then shoot just with their right hand. But in this one, Moore shoots with the right hand, but uses his left to kind of support the gun, holding arm. So he's kind of using both. And also, this is the first time where the sequence has Bond without a hat, which I must say I didn't pay attention to that. I obviously noticed that there was no hat, but I assumed that they'd have changed that earlier for Connery or Lazenby, but clearly not. So I need to look out for things other than nipples, I guess, because I'm missing out on these important details.
Yeah, and we're obviously doing the hat watch, and I thought that was interesting that this is the first gun barrel sequence where he's not wearing a hat. And obviously, we've said a few times, or I don't know if it's just me, Andy, because I got a fascination about hats. When is it that Bond is going to stop routinely wearing hats? And I wonder it's now. We've reached it. We're just going to have to check the next few films to see if that's it then. And now when we do our little hat watch, it's just always going to be a no. But yeah, so that's definitely the switch. And Andy, just a thought, and I don't know if you know this, it's just occurred to me where you mentioned about Moore holding the gun / arm with both hands. Has Bond always been right-handed? Do you know? Because I'm just thinking about the gun barrel. How he comes in and the stance. It's always the right hand. Has there been any Bonds that's left-handed? I don't know if you know that, or if any listeners can drop us a tweet or a message on any of the social media platforms.
I would have to assume he's always right-handed because I only remember the gun barrel sequence coming in from the right-hand side and then turning to his left, which means that he's firing with his right.
Yeah.
What an interesting question.
I'm full of them, Andy. Okay, so straight after the gun barrel sequence, we're straight at the UN. So it's in, I believe, New York. So this is obviously straight away in the film, and me and the missus were like, what? So we're at the UN, and the UK, focuses on the person representing the UK with the old headphones, because obviously, the translation is happening. But he gets assassinated, and then he kind of stands up, collapses on the desk in front of him. But then everyone else around the room is just like staring. He's like, oh, what's going on? No one seems interested or even shocked or even like moves to the bloke from the UK. So I don't know if that is that's the opinion. We just have such a low, in the UK, we're just so lowly thought of. And this is before Brexit, Andy, as well. There's no one is just like showing any kind of interest that the UK person's just like dropped dead in front of him. And then I think, in terms of all the marketing, you probably know who the baddie is. You have the bloke from the UK, and then there's 2 white blokes to the bloke's right. Then it cuts to Dr. Kananga, doesn't it? And Solitaire. And, obviously, you know that he's going to be the baddie, but it just cuts. He could have cut to anyone. And I think it's just highlighting that, this dude is suspicious.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder whether everyone just recognized that the speech was really boring and he'd just fallen asleep, and they were all like, yeah, he's fallen asleep. I don't blame him. And that's why they were not interested. But I know we've kind of not made note of how he died here, but it was kind of like death by sound, and it was a bit of a strange way to die. I thought I was trying to think of like the logistics of how it would have killed him, some sort of sound change into his brain, but I couldn't really figure it out. But something down the headphones clearly killed him.
I was thinking of going to say some witty comment about some kind of band, but I don't want to alienate any of our listeners by saying a particular type of band. But yeah. It was a bit weird because in the the translation room, you obviously just see a hand, and the is a bloke's hand, change the cables, doesn't he? And then does the thing. But yeah, I wonder if it's something like high frequency or something. But
yeah, must be. But it's probably a mystery to me and you and maybe no one else. Everyone probably knows, but yeah, for me, I couldn't really explain it. But from the UN, kind of just before we get inside, I thought the aerial shot as they showed the building was very shaky camera work, clearly done from a helicopter of some sort, but the camera work was quite shaky beforehand. But swiftly from New York, we're on to New Orleans, and we have a funeral procession coming through the streets, and we see the MI6 agent kind of leaning against a post, looking on as the funeral procession and the brass band goes by. It's a lot of effort to kill him, though, isn't it? I mean, he's leaning there, he's watching this procession, and the guy comes up to him, and he asks him the question, whose funeral is this? And he says, yours, and stabs him. Down he goes. The carriers of the coffin walk over to him, they drop the coffin on his body, and then when they lift the coffin up, he's gone. And then it turns into, a jazz brass band, which is the Olympia Brass Band, which is an American band from New Orleans. Happy music, and away they go. Very memorable scene. A lot of effort to kill an agent, or at least hide the body. But certainly one of the ones I remembered as kind of one of those iconic scenes that live in the memory.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Andy, there. I know it's just, I know, we talk about convoluted methods of killing or trying to assassinate people. We talked about Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd in the previous movie, but these are obviously all hide the bad, the baddie, the villains. Now, from my point of view, I'm thinking you could hire an assassin and it'd be one cost. But now this bloke has have to fork out on all the procession, funeral procession, paying for each of the people, that's done all the, the music and everything. It just adds up in terms of the cost. Yeah. So Andy, in terms of the brass band, interesting fact that the assassin is actually a member of the brass band, Alvin Alcorn. So I thought that was a nice little nod there. And the brass band plays two pieces of music. So you got your bit, the bit at the beginning that's a lot more down and sad, and that is actually called Just a Closer Walk with Thee. And then the bit where you said, and the music kind of then picks up, and then they drop the coffin and it's a bit more happier. Is Joe Avery's piece, also known as the New Second Line. So I thought that was a nice nod to actually have a quite famous American jazz band in the movie.
Yeah, it's a good touch, and a good touch about the assassin having that as part of the band ties it together nicely. We swiftly move on to Saint Monique and another agent being killed. We've got some sort of tribal ceremony and sacrifice, and this is the snake scene that we referred to earlier. It's a very fake looking snake, it has to be said. At no point did I think this was a real snake, or they were using a stuntman with real snake or anything like that. It was very obviously fake. And as someone who's not a fan of snakes, I didn't mind that at all. But it's obvious.
Yeah, it was definitely, it looked really rubbery, is what I put it down. Yeah, so Andy, this is one of the few Bond movies that doesn't feature James Bond in the initial sequence. I would say, do you know what the other one is? But, we've talked about this before, so I won't. But any listeners out there, there's been one other one so far, and it was From Russia with Love. And that is the one where you see Red Grant in the grounds of a mansion, and then you see someone impersonating Bond. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting one, because you usually kind of think all the intro sequences usually kind of focus on Bond. And now also, Andy, I thought this one, I don't know in terms of timings, I didn't measure this, but in this intro sequence, even before the intro sequence, in terms of the music, we've dotted around 3 locations already. So I thought that was I don't know in terms of timing how long that was, but you've gone from the UN with the assassination, you've gone to New Orleans, the assassination, then you've gone to San Monique with the assassination, and obviously that is where they talked about later on. But I thought that was quite interesting. The three different locations, even before you get into the opening title sequence with the music.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening. It felt quite fast. It kind of they dotted around place to place quite quickly, I thought, but I think it was a good use of that time to set the scene for what lies ahead, and there was a lot of action as well in those first few minutes.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the Diamonds Are Forever. The intro bit where Bond is tracking down Blofeld as well. So so we're into the title sequence now and the music. So as Andy mentioned, this is obviously Paul McCartney and the Wings. So this is the first true rock song used in an opening of a Bond film. So it's a good song as well. And also, Andy, this is the first Bond film that did not involve John Barry. So Barry was actually working on a musical, and he had fallen out actually with Harry Saltzman over the Diamonds Are Forever song. Saltzman apparently didn't like Diamonds Are Forever. He didn't like the tune, and he felt some of the words in there was quite dirty. So John Barry didn't come back for this film. And also, just a couple more points, Andy, before I pass over to you. Paul McCartney, obviously, massive artist, former Beatles. And due to his high salary, there wasn't actually enough music budget to afford a composer. So what happened was Paul McCartney and the producers managed to get George Martin, who obviously, I don't know if you're a fan of the Beatles. I personally am not, but he's famous for being a producer for the Beatles. So he actually ended up writing the score for this film.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very kind of keep it in house with the Beatles connection and McCartney doing a lot of the legwork. The song itself, an absolute banger. It was nominated for an Academy Award, but lost out to Barbra Streisand's "The Way We Were." Saltzman actually envisaged a female soul singer for the song. He originally hired BJ Arnoux, I'm going to say, is the pronunciation, BJ Arnoux, to record and perform the song, but didn't realise that McCartney had intended to perform it all along. But later in the film, we see BJ Arnoux performing the song during the nightclub scene where Bond and Leiter are at the table, which I thought was a nice little touch, having the theme song within the film. And not surprisingly, the song was a massive success in the US and UK charts, and Paul would perform it on his tour.
The song that they lost out in terms of the Oscars, the Barbra Streisand song. Are you familiar with it?
I'm not. Is it from? My guess would be, is it from A Star Is Born?
I don't know. I googled it and I listened to it on YouTube because I thought, I wanted to find out what song it lost out to. So I YouTubed it and I listened to it, and it's a good song. I don't know if it is the one that you just mentioned. Debatable if I think it's better than the Live and Let Die song, but it is a very famous and good song. But yeah, I don't know if you can find out if it is from the film that you just mentioned.
No, I think it's from the film of the same name, The Way We Were, which is not something I've heard of. So we'll cut that out because otherwise I'll sound stupid. Anyway, moving on. Following the opening sequence, we're over to Bond's house. It's early in the morning, not 8:48. It's 5:48. It's even earlier than I thought. 5:48 in the morning, and M makes a house call. We know it's 5:48 because it says on Bond's watch, which is a digital watch, which for 1973 is pretty new because the first one was only released in 1972, which was the Pulsar.
Yeah, and he's obviously got an electronic digital watch, and I suppose he's a spy, so he's got the latest mod cons. But I was a bit surprised with his house because the living room, I don't know if you call it the living room or not, it had a very classical feel to it, Andy. But then when you went into the kitchen, it was all full of like the mod cons. It was very modern, so it had two kind of conflicting styles in his house. thought that was quite interesting. So I don't know if he decorated it. It's one of those things where you think, obviously, he did have a wife. Did they do one room? He did the other room, but obviously that's not the situation in this circumstance. But yeah, and he's obviously got a fancy coffee maker as well, which didn't seem overly impressed with, did he, when he got his coffee in the end?
Didn't seem impressed with anything really in this scene.
No, he didn't. And then we've got Moneypenny arriving at Bond's house. So we've got and Bond in the kitchen. And then we've got Moneypenny who just, he comes in. And I wonder whether she's ever been there before. She, obviously I meant in a purely platonic way, Andy, because I don't think Moneypenny or Bond have done anything apart from flirting and the kiss. Was it Lazenby when you point, picked up? Yeah, and a bit of a slap, wasn't it, as well. But Moneypenny sees a half naked Miss Caruso, who's the missing Italian agent that M is mentioning to Bond about following his latest mission. So I thought that was I liked it that they were in Bond's house. It wasn't the normal M's office. There's an urgency about, this mission isn't there because the three agents have died. So he's gone to make a house call.
Yeah, I like that as well. Obviously, early in the morning would suggest the urgency. Could have just called him on his mobile, but 1973, so that would have been a problem. Bond is rocking some personalised PJs. Good spot, Jay. I'd not paid attention. I think I was looking for nipples again or something. I'm going to read this note, and I don't know what it means, but you've put, I wonder if the current Bond shops at Etsy. Now this is me showing my lack of modern awareness, but what's Etsy? Or who is Etsy? Or where is Etsy?
Just so people know, we are not sponsored by Etsy. This episode has not been sponsored by Etsy. So Etsy is a platform, a website where basically you could make stuff and then sell it. So it's all like customized. So it could be bookmarks, pajamas, pottery, those family calendars that you see with cartoon people, pebble people. So it's basically a website where anyone can make something and sell it on their platform. So when I made that note, I just wondered whether Bond was basically, if it was a current Bond like Daniel Craig, is he on Etsy doing his personalized Jim Jams? Because obviously you can't just rock up to M&S and just, look through all those ones. So you have to personalize it somehow. So, in my comment, and it's funny because the day before I was on Etsy looking for something, and I think that's why I made a comment. You're going to check it out, but Etsy, anyone listening from Etsy, you can sponsor us if you want.
Yeah, we accept all forms of cash.
Even Bitcoin.
I'm not sure about Bitcoin. I don't even know what Etsy is, so how am I going to cope with Bitcoin? But anyway, before I dig my uncool hole any further, so M's with Bond, he's giving him a bit of stick. He's trying out the magnetic watch, a bullet strength. M's very annoyed throughout the scene. I think this is the spot where he kind of uses the magnet to take his spoon away from him, even though she's still across the room, which I thought was quite amusing. And as they're leaving, Moneypenny says goodbye, but then she pauses and adds, or should I say, ciao Bella, which was a nice little touch, because obviously Bond doesn't know that she knows that Miss Caruso's in the house, but Moneypenny knows because she's kind of helped hide her.
Yeah, and sorry for anyone out there who's Italian, who we just butcher their language when we do, little ciao bellas and stuff like that, or when we do our little one-liners and quotes. We're not actors, even though Andy obviously in the last episode was pushing out his services there.
And let's add fluent Italian to my resume. Ciao Bella. There you go. If it wasn't offensive before, I've added a bit of an accent, so there you go.
I think it's really good. Yeah, so, you just mentioned about the magnetic watch. So Bond uses that to slowly unzip Miss Caruso's dress. And this is one of those things where, we said it before, Andy, where it happens, you kind of, or it's just about to happen, you kind of recall that is, you remember that bit. And also, and Miss Caruso has the honor of being Roger Moore's first Bond girl. I think that's a big honor. We're just in the movie, and we've got Bond girl number 1 for Roger Moore. And interesting fact as well that Miss Caruso is played by Madeline Smith, and Madeline Smith and Roger Moore actually appear together on the TV show The Persuaders, and was recommended by Roger Moore for this role. Andy, I don't know if you've seen The Persuaders. I've seen the odd episode because my dad just watches stuff on UK Gold all the time. So whenever I've gone around there, or when I was growing up, leaving, before going off to uni and stuff like that, he used to always he still does have UK Gold on. And I remember things like The Saint, The Persuaders and all that. So I don't know. Obviously, it's before both our times, but I don't know if you're familiar with The Persuaders.
I know of The Persuaders. My dad was big into The Saint as well. Not so much The Persuaders, I don't think, but yeah, like your dad, mine's always watching the old UK Gold channel. Usually, Only Fools and Horses is his go-to, but no link to the Bond movie as far as we're aware.
And talking about old shows and fathers, Andy, my dad this year wanted box sets of Thunderbirds, Joe 90, Captain Scarlet. So I was looking around, and because they're obviously old shows, it took me a bit of time to find them DVD box sets, and they're not cheap either, because they're so old. So yes, it was a bit frustrating. But that's I wonder, when we both get older, if we're lucky enough to get older, will we be watching programs that we watched when we were younger, and our kids will be like thinking what we think, like, why aren't you watching more modern programs? Are we going to be stuck in that cycle? Because I think, when I'm listening to certain music, I listen to modern music, but there's days where I will listen to music that I listened to when I was a teenager. And then I think, I wonder if I'm going to be the same with TV programs, watching programs with like dodgy CGI and bits like that in the future, when there's going to be loads more advanced films.
That is interesting. So I am the opposite. I don't listen to much modern music at all. I think I've listened to one album that was released this calendar year. I'm not with it. But from a TV perspective, it's interesting you say that. We touched on briefly that I'm a big pro wrestling fan, and I'm currently going through old episodes of Monday Night Raw from the mid to late 90s, kind of in order, just to see what happened back in the heyday. So that's a good trip down memory lane. I think at the moment I'm about 25 years behind where we are today. So I've kind of already begun that journey, just in a very niche market.
And you're younger than me, and you.
I am. Let's get back to the film, and Miss Caruso. In the Italian version of the movie, she's actually a French agent, which is quite an interesting little sidebar. From Bond's house, we're on to New York next. We get the initial pickup after his arrival. He's looking the part. Is more. He's very sophisticated, very smart. And I think, touching on a point that your wife made around him being more of a gentleman, I think that comes across in these scenes, that he's got that kind of gentlemanly appearance, a bit more. Maybe it's just a bit more grown up than Connery, and maybe that's reflected in the age of the actors and maybe the age of Bond at this time. But he's a bit more of a sophisticated gentleman, I would say, at this point. We also get to see Felix Leiter, who's appeared in several films now, and yet again it's a different actor. This time around it's David Hedison who takes on the part. Interesting fact about Hedison, him and Jeffrey Wright are the only actors to play Leiter more than once. So we know we're going to see Hedison later on in the series, but up to this point, every appearance of Felix Leiter has been played by a different actor.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I didn't realize that David Hedison played Felix in this movie. I remember him from the later movie. I do. So I didn't realize he was in this earlier movie. And there's quite a few years between this one and the next one he appears in. So I thought that was interesting that they had him come back. Carrying on, so Bond's driver is shot, and I would say this is a true drive-by shooting, Andy, because the driver, when we find out it's Whisper, uses the gun in the side mirrors to shoot Bond's driver. It's unlucky, the Bond's driver has the window open because they're on I don't, correct me, Andy, you've been to America. Is it like a freeway that they're on? They're on some kind of like ring road or something, aren't they? I don't think it's just a normal street from memory.
I'm going to go
like an overpass or something,
freeway.
wasn't it?
Are they going over one of the bridges?
Right.
My New York bridge knowledge is somewhat limited. I don't know if it's the Brooklyn Bridge, for example. Could be wrong on that, but yeah, I think it's freeway leading to the bridge.
Just just because I'm a bit anal, I never had my windows open on motorways or ring roads because of the speed that you're traveling at. The air resistance coming through the window makes you use more petrol/diesel. So I always keep my windows closed. Anyway, interesting point. If the Bond's driver was similar to me in terms of being tight, in terms of petrol and diesel, he would have had the window closed and therefore potentially saving his life, just to point out. So we see later on, not too much later, we see Bond locating the car that Whisper's been driving. And then you see him, Bond, examining the side mirror. And I thought, why? Because Bond didn't see Whisper using the side mirror to shoot the driver. So why is he kind of gravitating to that side mirror? How did he know that the gun? Because, as far as Bond knew, because he was obviously looking around, but Whisper could have just shot, just had his arm, across the, inside of his car to shoot him. Why was Bond, looking, on the side mirror? I thought that was a bit weird.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, because he didn't even notice that he'd been shot straight away, did he? So he definitely couldn't have seen the shot, or even indeed where it originated from. So maybe it's just a lucky guess on his part. I've added a note here, and I know this is not really too interesting as such, but something we've noted in previous films is that there are obvious uses of stuntmen, which of course there will be stuntmen used throughout, but the blatantness of the stuntmen has been obvious to see in the film so far. But I thought at this scene particularly, not so much. I'm assuming it was a stuntman used here, but at no point did I think, oh, that's definitely a stuntman. I think the way they shot it was much better than in previous films. So a sign of improvement, I would say, in this scene, if nowhere else. We continue with New York, and we've got a taxi journey into Harlem. Bond's picked up by a taxi driver, and it made some comment around what I'd do for $20, and the taxi driver, who's a black guy, actually says to Bond, for $20, I'd take him to a Ku Klux Klan cookout, which was a funny little line, I thought. And I guess $20 back in 1973 was a fair chunk of change.
So, yeah, so Bond now arrives in Harlem, and it just seems like everyone was involved with the criminal the underworld here, because as Bond is, the taxi driver of Bond is following, the car, you just see like random people radio in where Bond's location was. And then when the taxi driver stops and lets him out, he then gets the radio out, doesn't he? And says, oh, he's coming in. So it just seems like everyone is on the payroll within, that whole sequence. So I don't know how realistic that was. And then we're introduced to T.H. Johnson for the first time. And, his pincer tip prosthetic arm, which I don't know if you notice it, Sandy, and I don't know if I'm just being a bit picky. But, if you put the arms out together, that one is just blatantly so long. And it looked like, I don't know if this is how they did it, he's basically holding the pincer bit, the actor. It just looks so obvious that it's too long. It's not like, in this, he obviously says later on that he lost his arm. I think crocodile, alligator bit it off. But it just looks like basically the pincer is added to his hand so that it's just too long, is what I noticed pretty much straight away.
Yeah, I agree. It's almost like he's wearing a big metal glove
Yeah.
rather than a fake arm.
Yeah.
So in this scene, we've got a couple of henchmen that are kind of escorting Bond to his imminent doom, I believe. So he needs to get rid of them, and he does very, very easily. I thought as they're kind of walking through some of the back streets, he pulls a ladder down from kind of a fire exit. One of the guys bumps into that, and he's out cold. And then Bond comes around with a pretty weak-looking kick, it has to be said, and the henchmen are down, and they stay down. I thought it was just very, very weak on their behalf that they would go down so easily. Moving on, let's keep the story rolling. We're off to San Monique next. Bond goes to check into his hotel room, and Mrs. Bond has changed his room on his behalf. And the receptionist says, "Mrs. Bond has been expecting you," which I wonder whether that was a subtle callback to Blofeld and the "We've been expecting you, Mr. Bond" line from previous films. That was just a nice little touch there.
Yeah, I didn't pick that point up, Andy. I picked up that it was obviously Mrs. Bond, but yeah, I didn't pick up any kind of potential relationship that you kind of picked up there in terms of Blofeld. So we see, a little bit later on, Bond is having a nice bath and shave. I don't know, this is the first time we see Bond having a bath, Andy, but that whole sequence, that scene is just, it just seems to be Bond is more, he's stylish and he's looking after himself. But we see someone release a snake through a hatch. But, Bond doesn't he doesn't find the snake for a little while. So we then got Whisper comes in into the room. Bond's having a bath and he obviously gets out and Whisper's dropping off the drink and then he leaves. And I don't know if this is a continuity error or not, and I put it on the notes. I don't know if you noticed this, and it might be completely wrong, but when Whisper's in the living room or the main room of the hotel, Bond is in there and he obviously signs off to the receipt to say he's got the drink. Then he returns to the bathroom, but I didn't notice Bond turning off the light in the main room. But then we see Bond then killing the snake, and then he returns to the living room, the main room, and the lights are off, because then you start seeing like the hand and gun come through the door. So I don't know if I missed that he turned the lights off or not, or I'm just getting confused about that bit. But that's the note I made, I can't remember him turning it off, because the next bit, because it's not lit up when the gun and the hand comes through, it's just something I noticed. I don't know if it's a continuity bit or he flicks the light off for some reason, but he didn't have the light off in the living room when he was having a bath anyway, because when Whisper walks in, the light is on.
I can't say no to it, but it's a good point, because I think the lighting is quite important to the hand coming through the door in terms of the shadows and stuff. So that's an interesting one. Good spot. We see that the hand belongs to Rosie Carver, the CIA operative. Eventually, he figures out that she's not the enemy. She is on the same side, at least for now. He's been very smooth, very charming, quite gentlemanly. Later on, we see Bond in a change of clothes, and not only does he rock the denim, but he also goes double denim at one point, which is a very big departure from Connery's portrayal of Bond, which I don't think had any denim at all. Was always kind of much more smartly dressed, but maybe this is just a sign of the times, more of a 70s look for Roger Moore. And later on, Bond and Rosie, they're off to find the location of where the agent was murdered so they can investigate. Bond gets getting a bit suspicious. They stop for a bit, and he pulls a gun out on her and says something about not killing her before the deed. She makes a getaway, and she's shot by one of the scarecrows, which seem to have, I think, is it cameras for eyes, and then obviously some sort of firing mechanism as well.
Yeah, that's. I thought that was quite good. I don't know what your opinion of Rosie is, Andy, and I don't know if you want to touch on this a bit later on when we do the rankings, but I don't think she was a strong Bond girl personally. And I don't know if she, because obviously you find out that she's working for Mr. Big / Mr. Dr. Kananga, but she comes across as you know, in that initial bit, quite ditzy and scared, but I don't know, like a bit fumbling. So I don't know if all that was a bit of an act to try to get Bond to lower his guard or not. Because then you obviously find out that bit that you just mentioned, that she's actually working for the bad guys. So I don't know, yeah, what your view of was.
Ditzy is the first word that comes to mind. It's good that you said that, because that's exactly my thought about her. And I guess we don't really get to find out whether it is an act or not. And I guess there's arguments that it could be either way. But yeah, she doesn't seem particularly strong-willed or strong-minded. But I guess if you're wanting to get onto Bond's good side, acting a bit ditzy and, you know, needing a strong man to put his arms around you is probably the best way to act. So maybe she's a genius.
Maybe. But obviously Tracy was very strong-minded, wasn't she? And she was lucky to become Bond's wife. Short-lived, obviously. So carrying on, we see Bond and Quarrel Jr. So you see Bond on a hang glider, Andy, and he's being pulled by Quarrel's boat. You've, you know, to the couple of points there, he's just like, you know, the smoothness as well, because he's being pulled, you know, with the hang glider by the boat. And he's just enjoying a cigar, just, you know, up there as well. And this isn't actually stated in the film, but, you know, as part of the research that we did, Quarrel Jr. Is supposed to be the son of Quarrel from Dr. No. So I thought that was a nice little link, because obviously this is set in and around the Caribbean. So Jamaica as well as San Monique. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. And, you know, in terms of stylish, we see Bond, and me and the missus both commented on this straight away. So Bond lands on the island, he knocks out the goon, and then he does the reversible suit. So, you know, very practical. He's always got to look the part, hasn't he? You know, a lot of other kind of spy movies, the main person wouldn't be bothered about, you know, reversing his suit jacket, would he? He just kind of just get on with the mission. But Bond, you know, just flips it straight away, and then kind of proceeds into the building.
Yeah, it's good if you need to get a disguise and a quick getaway. Just, you know, turn your jacket inside out. You're a new person, practically. That was a nice little touch. We see that Bond meets Solitaire. They have a little bit of a back and forth over the tarot deck. And there's the card, the Lovers, drawn, which clearly makes Solitaire think that Bond is the man for her. And I think there's a bit earlier in the film where she calls it on her own before Bond arrives, and then she picks the card again and it's the Lovers again. So clearly that's a sign. And then we find out that actually it was rigged and every card is the same. So Bond's manipulated her with the tarot deck. Bond and Solitaire do what Bond does, and it turns out that Solitaire is actually a virgin. So Bond has the honor of taking her honor, in a way. I don't know if there's no more graceful way of saying that. But yeah, it turns out she was saving herself for Kananga, or at least Kananga's expecting her to save herself for him, because I think there's a reference that later on to how her mother saved herself for Kananga or treated him. So that was quite disturbing in a way. I think it was a bit. I felt like that detail was a little bit unnecessary. But one thing that I think you noted, and I totally agree with, is that Moore is more tender, gentle with the ladies than Connery was as Bond. He's he's clearly still a womanizer, and he's still getting plenty of action, but he seems to be a little bit more respectful as Bond than Connery was.
Yeah, he's definitely more tender, respectful. I don't know, Andy, because he's just rigged the card deck. So, I think he's still
wrong
Bond.
Word. Yeah.
And I wonder, you know, could he's
maybe he's refined his technique a little bit.
Because and obviously, you know, when he reveals the deck and it's rigged, I wonder whether he just had to buy tons of cards then to take out the Lovers one and then put them all in one deck, or can you just buy a deck just full of Lovers? can you just imagine Bond after he just slept with Rosie? Because he goes to the card shop then, doesn't he, at the hotel room? And then he just says, "Oh, I want need to buy 200 cars." And he just, sat there on the deck or something, just picking out, I need that one, and that one, just to do this plan.
Just in the gift shop. Yeah, and in his suitcase, he's got all the other cards filled up to take back as a souvenir.
Carrying on. Actually, another point, Andy. Kananga had a lot of restraint, didn't he? Because he was obviously expecting to be a first. Solitaire is a very good-looking lady, so he's done well to resist, hasn't he? There, for I don't know how many years Solitaire's been working for him, but yeah, definitely. So carrying on, so we've got Bond and Solitaire are escaping. But another point, so this is the same with Harlem. Everyone on the island seems to be working for Kananga. So everyone's just involved with this. The bit, before he's obviously escaping, where Solitaire was going through the fields with all the, the plants and everything. And then, he's going to find a vehicle to get away, and you just got like the police are there radioing, and you just got everyone just seems to be working for Kananga. And so it's a very close-knit community. And I quite like this as well with Bond driving a double-decker bus. I don't recall him driving a double-decker bus before this film, and he's chased by the henchmen and goons. And Andy, just a little fact that I didn't put down in these notes, in some of those scenes, Roger Moore was actually driving the bus as well. They did get a stuntman who was a bus driver doing the dangerous bits, and apparently he was practicing for something like 6 weeks as well. But there were actually some bits where Roger Moore was actually, doing the driving and being closely observed by the stuntman.
That's interesting. And maybe that's why it's not obviously stuntmen being used, because it's not always. So that's an interesting point. The double-decker bus is being chased by the goons on, I think are they police bikes? It's the local police that work for Kananga. But as they're going along the road, there seems to be a bit of a puddle. I don't know if it's a leak or something, but there's a bit of a wet patch on the road, and the bikes go flying. Just fall off way too easy. I think one even goes like up and over the edge of the road. It's it's like bikes are not made for wet weather. It seems to be much too easy for Bond to escape them. We're back in New Orleans next. Bond and Solitaire arrive. They're picked up by a taxi driver. Just so happens to be the same driver that picked them up in New York as well. And he refers to Bond as Jim. Which obviously short for James, but a nice little bit of disrespect there, I thought, by the taxi driver. And later on, we see Bond try his hand as a flight instructor. There's a flight school at the airport, and Bond nips in, and there's a female student, I guess, for lack of a better term, that he's having waiting for her lesson. And there's a bit of a chase round at the airport in the plane with Kananga's goons in hot pursuit.
Yeah, I like this bit, Andy. I did, because we obviously mentioned in the previous film we got the moon buggy chase, and I definitely thought this was a marked improvement with the plane and the car chase. It's obviously not it's not long. It doesn't cover vast amount of distance. It's basically just going around the airfield, the air hangar, isn't it? But I did like that. But Bond is still looking very stylish. He's still looking the part, Roger Moore is. So we get to see another funeral procession. I don't know if this is a continuity bit or they just reused it, but in the background, you can see the extras that was in the background from the opening scene are in the same places. So there's a bit where the band is kind of coming around the corner onto like the main street where you see, and then there's two blokes stood on a corner. I don't know, it's like a pub entrance, and they were there in the first bit, and then I noticed they were there in this bit. So I don't know if this basically reused that shot, or they did two bits, when they were filming it, one for the beginning and one for this bit. So I noticed that.
Yeah, I didn't pick up on that. I guess you could make the argument that everyone works for Kananga, or Mr. Big. Spoiler alert for the next point I'm about to make. One of the next points I'm about to make. So you could probably forgive them for reusing the same shot, but yeah, I would imagine that's probably just a save on budget, since they seem to be cutting it every film. I mentioned this briefly earlier. So they're in a bar. I think it's a chain bar with the same name as the bar they were in New York earlier in the film. And Bond has a bourbon whiskey drink. There's no martini to be had. And this is the scene we briefly referred to earlier with BJ Arnault singing the theme song on stage. And it's the only Bond film to feature the theme on screen as well as part of the opening credits. So that's a nice little Easter egg there. And it's at around this point that we find out that Mr. Big and Dr. Kananga are indeed the same person.
So, Andy, were you surprised? Because obviously we watched this before, and the missus didn't realise this. But obviously, when you first introduced to Mr. Big, at the beginning, when Bond is, first meets T.E. Johnson and Solitaire, I obviously recalled, they're the same people. The wife didn't recall that, but I was just, because of the fake face, I can't remember when I first watched that, if that was a surprise or not, or, a big revelation. I don't know if you recall that, or if it was such a genuine twist or not.
I think it was supposed to be a shock, but I don't recall being shocked. It certainly wasn't this time round, but I don't remember the twist from before. So it was like I knew without them actually being clear. And also particularly the earlier scenes with Mr. Big, the fake face was not that great. It was kind of, it didn't look realistic enough to be a good enough disguise. And that may be more down to, the special effects of the time as opposed to, laziness on the behalf of the filmmakers. But yeah, there wasn't enough to differentiate that this was in fact two different people, or was supposed to be two different people. I think it was just kind of almost a worst kept secret.
Yeah, it wasn't up to the level of The Sixth Sense with that twist.
Indeed, I would go along with that.
I couldn't think of any other films with twists.
I'm trying to think of films with twists.
Star Wars, the father bit, Vader, where he says he's the father of Luke Skywalker. That was a revelation.
I mean, I've not really seen Star Wars because I'm not a fan, but yeah, you'd be pretty mad if Mr. Big turned out to be Mr. Bond's father. Now that's a twist. Just if anyone wants to make Live and Let Die 2, that would how I would change the story of that. Mr. Big is actually Mr. Bond Senior. But let's get back to the first installment of Live and Let Die before we ruin any potential remakes. T.E. Johnson. I'm guessing this is where the name T.E. comes from, but he's always smiling. Like in every scene, absolutely loves what he does. He is winning at life. We move on, and there's a test that Bond and Solitaire kind of pass. There's the test. I think it's something to do with a serial number on the watch, if I recall correctly. They pass the test. Bond is carried out by a whisper, and that's where he's taken to the crocodile farm, or crocodile and alligator farm. Now this is the scene we touched on earlier, and it's fantastic. For those who haven't seen it, just definitely check this out. And what he basically does is he uses the alligators and crocodiles as stepping stones to escape from the island back to dry land. One thing I noticed, kind of before we get into the stunt itself, is that he's not exactly forced onto the island. He's just having a casual stroll with the henchmen around him, and then he's on the island. Then all of a sudden, the bridge is retracted with T.E. and his mates on board, and Bond is stuck there in the middle. But it's not like they shoved him or forced him onto that island. He just kind of wandered on there, which was a little bit odd. And Bond keeping his guard down there.
Yeah, I agree, Andy. It is very much he's just having a conversation with T.E. Johnson, and then he kind of turns around and realizes that T.E. Johnson is on the what's it called, like the bridge that is being drawn in. I can't think of what the name is, but yeah, he's just there, isn't he?
Bond he's dropped the ball there. A rare mistake by someone so professional. So the stunt itself, we touched on this earlier, was performed by Ross Kananga, who also owned the crocodile farm. The stunt took 5 attempts, and the stuntman received 193 stitches in his head and leg. That is a lot of stitches. One point here that I didn't realize this is Jay's research, so well done on kind of finding these points. Ross's father was eaten by crocodiles. That's pretty scary stuff. So for the son to do that after that's happened to his father, that takes some cojones for sure. And a little bit about how they kind of performed the stunt. So the crocodiles were immobilized. The crocodiles were immobilized even by a line being tied down in the water using weights. And the stuntman Ross Kananga was paid $60,000 to perform this, which is around $377,000 in today's money. So that's a nice payday. Sadly, he didn't really get to enjoy it much because 5 years later, at the age of only 32, he died of a cardiac arrest while spearfishing. So very, very young to lose your life, of course. And spearfishing for this kind of stuntman sounds like an appropriate way to go, doing kind of danger sports or whatever you may call it. But yeah, age 32 took me a bit by surprise that he died so young.
Firstly, what I can do is there is actually a YouTube video of the stuntman doing this 5 times, and you can see him failing and getting bitten and stuff by the crocodiles, because even though the crocodiles are immobilized, they can obviously move their head still. And what they were saying was, after they did it once or twice, the crocodiles were then expecting someone running over them, so they were like always lifting their heads up because they were anticipating it. So it just become more dangerous as it carried on. So what I could do is share that stunt scene when we publish this episode, and then people can check it out if they want to. Andy, $377,000. I don't know what that equates to in pounds, but would you do that 5 times running across the alligators?
Not if I required 193 stitches afterwards. I wouldn't. I'd need a slightly bigger payday, that's for sure. And maybe just the 1 attempt rather than 5, but I guess it would have to be 1 successful attempt. Otherwise, someone else would be enjoying all that sweet, sweet moolah.
Yeah, apparently they did it 4 times. And then the director, Guy Hamilton, were basically ready to call it because it just wasn't working. And then Ross Kananga said, "Oh, give me another go," and then he landed it on that last one. So he definitely had, like you said, some balls to do it.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. I wonder though, if we consider some of the dodgy special effects we've had in the series so far, and some of the very suspect camera cuts and scenery and all that kind of stuff, is it not just better to get 5 fake crocodiles and float them in the water? I mean, it might not look quite so good, but it's certainly going to be safer, you would think.
Yeah, because obviously in which film is it? The one with the sharks, and they had the incident with the stuntmen and the live sharks in the pool as well. So they do. I don't think they have a disclaimer. Where they have a disclaimer to say no animals were injured in the film. I don't think they have these disclaimers on these earlier Bond films. Yeah, so after this bit, we've got Andy's favourite scene, which is the boat chase. And as Andy mentioned, the boat chase includes going over a piece of land, interrupting a wedding. My comment here, Andy, was this seemed to go on for quite a long time. And my note was, did it go on too long? It was entertaining. It included, boats going on over cross patches of land. It was all very interesting, exciting. But I don't know. I just thought it went on a bit too long. Some action sequences when you watch films, you think, it's gone a bit too long. And this one, I think it was good because it wasn't just about the speedboat going around, the various bits in the crocodile farm. You've just got this like transitions between various bits, and then it ends up with the dock, doesn't it, with like the bigger boats. and then the explosion. So it did transition through a number of different locations. But yeah, for me, my comment was, oh, that went on a bit too long. And I can't remember if this is a bit then when I went on to, I think it was when I was, picked up my phone and did a bit of Googling about Roger Moore, I think then.
It was a long scene, yeah, and I think if it was cut slightly, that would have been fine. So I'll take those points on board. But I thought it was quite action packed, so I did enjoy it. But it was certainly much longer than previous chase scenes that we've seen. I'm reminded of, I believe it was Doctor No, where there's a boat chase scene, and the camera work is really, really bad, and we see the kind of nearly crashing into the rocks, even though he's nowhere near the rock. And it was really quite poorly done. This was really, really well done, I thought. Very well shot. Like I said, action throughout. But yeah, if you trim a few seconds here and there, you probably don't lose too much. So that's a good point.
And Andy, you mentioned the wedding as well. So you commented that the cake gets destroyed, the big day is ruined. You also mentioned about there's just no reaction apart from the bride. So I don't know if the groom is thinking, oh, is being saved? Had the vows been done or not? Has he had a close escape?
I think this was just so obvious that nobody reacted except for the bride. It was just like, it looked like they knew it was going to happen and they were just watching it unfold. So it was a little bit taking out the moment. But it's an interesting point you made in terms of as the groom had a lucky escape. Maybe what would have made this, take it to the next comedy level is if the priest would have said, if there's anyone here who finds reason why they shouldn't be married, please speak now. And at that point, the boat comes in. I'm just, throwing that out there. If you need my directing and producing skills in Hollywood, I'm an all-rounder. But that's how I would have done it differently from a comedy timing perspective. But also, it was a nice little touch. Sorry, go ahead.
Also, Andy, adding on to that point, which is a great point, it could have been Bond going over, sweeping up the bride because it's going to be another Bond gal, and then carrying on. And then that's the introduction. So the groom gets a lucky escape, but then Bond gets the bride.
Yeah, he could have thrown in a famous one-liner in there as well.
Yes.
Like, who's thinking on the spot? Something like, "Do you want to sail away with me?" Even though we'll work on that. Yes. Give me time, Hollywood. I'll be back in touch. But let's continue with the current movie rather than starting my ill-fated movie career off on a bad foot. We are then introduced to Sheriff J.W. Pepper. I believe I mistakenly referred to him as Sergeant earlier. He's a sheriff who's in this and the next Bond film, so he's a recurring character. I think the intention was to use him a bit of comic relief, and certainly, he's kind of a typical hillbilly type. Reminded me a little bit of Smokey and the Bandit, has to be said. I don't know which one came first, but it's that's the thing that came to mind. But also very bigoted, very racist. It's a bit, it's not going to wash in today's times. I think, we talked earlier about how introducing black actors and a black Bond girl seemed to be a step forward in terms of, racial equality and, the kind of, the equality issues that a lot of black actors would have faced at the time. This seems like it almost undoes all that hard work by being so stereotypical and bigoted. So it's a bit close to the knuckle. It's an okay character. It's, like I said, a bit of comic relief, but it's a little bit uncomfortable when you're rewatching it back all these years later.
Yeah, I agree. And Andy, another thing actually that I just remembered as part of the research, as part of the chase with the boats, there's a bit where the boat lands on the sheriff's car. That wasn't scripted. That was an accident. Okay. But the sheriff, J.W. Pepper, he kept in character. So they were able to actually use that. It's shot in the actual film.
Oh, that's interesting. I would have assumed that was just scripted. That was quite a good moment of the scene.
Yeah.
Nice little Easter egg. Bond casually arrives at the dock, CIA and the police are waiting for him, and the sheriff turns up, and he can't believe it when he finds out that Bond is a secret agent. I think he was really looking forward to nailing this guy, and then all of a sudden it's a secret agent, and he's on his side. So it's a bit of disappointment for the sheriff there, but a nice way to round out what was a very good scene.
Yeah, definitely. It was funny, that end bit. So we're back in San Monique. So we see Solitaire is tied up now. So we've got the voodoo ceremony and she's tied up. The Baron makes a co-entrance, doesn't he, Andy, in terms of the grave? I thought that was good. So there's a fight between Bond and Samedi. It's very short, isn't it? There, it's not one of those. There's some films where Bond is fighting one of the main primary henchmen, or I know there's obviously T.E. Johnson as well, but this one was over, short and sweet.
Yeah, very, very short, quite effective, but it took me by surprise just how short that was. We've got Kananga here, and he shoots one of the gas/air pellets into the sofa that Whisper was sitting on, and it inflates, which I guess is a precursor of what's to come in a few moments' time, but it was a little bit strange, I thought, because isn't there still a hole in the sofa where the pellet went through? But maybe that's just thinking about a little bit too long. And then there's another scene that comes up, which again was one of the ones that I remembered, and I think it's one of those kind of all-time memorable scenes where Bond and Solitaire are about to be fed to the sharks. They're tied to some sort of hanging platform, and Bond gets his arm sliced so the blood drips into the water. But Bond is very unlucky with animals, because this is sharks and crocodiles in the same film that he's about to be fed to, but somehow escapes.
Yeah, there's can't be many films, can there, where the main actor, the main character, is nearly eaten by a shark and a crocodile. He's obviously, like we mentioned earlier on, Bond has a run-in with a number of sharks, but this is in both of them in one film. 2 alpha predators in the one film Bond encounters.
Indeed. Maybe we'll be on unofficial animal watch for future films to see if this occurs again. And then final point from me about San Monique is Bond gets one of the gas air pellets and he puts in Kananga's mouth, and Kananga explodes. No blood splatter. You'd think, a human body exploding the way it did, there'd be blood everywhere. And I took this note because it reminded me of Violet Beauregard in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where she just continually inflates and has to be rolled away to the deflating room or whatever it's called. But the visual of Kananga inflating before exploding just took me back to that film.
Yeah, and obviously Kananga doesn't have any Oompa Loompas working for him, where everyone else, it seems to be working for him. There's no Oompa Loompas around. Willy Wonka isn't a film I like, Andy. Chocolate Factory. I've read the book, but it's not a film I like. Moving on. So yeah, Andy, I don't know what your thought of this was. Whisper, does he survive? Because he's locked in the metal capsule that we see. It's implied, unless I missed it, that he's got a weakened lungs. That's why he whispers. And the capsule is airtight. So I don't know how long he was surviving the capsule. Do you think he survives, or do you think now that Kananga's dead and the CIA arrives that he's just taken off and, there's some jail time? What's your view on that? That was my thought when that happened.
That is interesting. Can't say I've put much thought into it, but I'm going to assume that he was arrested, but probably in a very weakened state, because, like you said, he wouldn't survive in there for very long. But then I guess, who's there to free him? Maybe he's still there to this day. We'll never know.
It's open to interpretation, then, audience interpretation. I like that sometimes when they do that in movies, or they just forgot about him and didn't do an ending for him. Anyway, so we're on the ending now, the end scene. So we're on the train. I had to Google this bit after the film, so I didn't do it straight away. So Bond makes a quip about the unlucky at cards when he loses to Solitaire. So yeah, I Googled this. So this is the reverse of being lucky at cards, unlucky at love. So it's just the reverse. Also, Andy, I didn't write this down, but a fault. Is this one of the few times that we see Bond lose at cards?
I think it's got to be, hasn't it?
Because we usually see him obviously winning, but he loses to solitaire playing one Ginny.
So now I'm thinking about it. I can think of one other place where he loses or is seemingly losing for a while, and that's in Casino Royale, where he needs to be forwarded some more money to continue the game. Spoiler alert for episode 21 of the series. That's the only one that comes to mind off the top of my head, but that's an interesting point.
So this potentially is the first time up until that film. Maybe we can track it in future to see. But yeah, when it happened, yeah, it's just one of those things. You just always kind of relate Bond to winning in cards. So yeah, it's just a little note.
Not just cards as well. Think of scenes where he's played golf or shooting or whatever. He always seems to be on the winning side. We get T.H. Johnson back on the train. A bit of a scrap between the two of them. And I believe this will be the first fight on a train since From Russia with Love. Possibly not quite as memorable as that fight scene, but still quite an effective use of the fight scene. I did quite like the bit where I think it's Teehee shuts Solitaire into the fold-up bed, and she's very unhappy with Bond afterwards because I'm not sure she realizes who it was that did it. And then the film ends with the shot of the outside of the train, and Baron Samedi is sat on the front of the train as it chugs along, which I thought was a very cool ending. I did wonder whether this was kind of a way of opening up as a reintroduction, but also it confirms that he didn't die in the earlier fight scene. But I thought that was a nice way to end the film before we go into the closing credits. Okay, so that's the end of the film. Let's move on to a few quotes and one-liners that we saw. I'll take this first one, which was an exchange between the cabbie and Bond in New York. So the cabbie starts with, "You know where you're going? Uptown, I believe." "Uptown? You're headed into Harlem, man. Well, you just keep on the tail of that jukebox, and there's an extra 20 in it for you. Hey, man, for $20, I'll take you to a Ku Klux Klan cookout."
Lovely, brilliant. It was funny, that scene. So I don't have the acting chops like Andy. So this is the bit where Andy mentioned, about the good ending of the boat chase. So this is J.W. Pepper, sheriff. So he goes, "There's that son of a bitch. I got him. What are you, some kind of doomsday machine? Well, we got a cage strong enough to hold an animal like you here." Then Felix Leiter goes, "Captain, would you enlighten the sheriff, please?" Trooper, "Yes, sir. JW, let me have a word with you." JW, "Now this fella's from London, England. He's an Englishman working in cooperation with our boys. Sorta secret agent." Then JW goes, "Secret agent? On whose side?"
That was nice. I was hoping you'd go into a full-on JW accent there.
I can't do accents at all.
"What are you, some kind of doomsday machine, boy?" It's my terrible attempt. We'll edit that out. No one needs to hear that. The scene at the start of the film, so the MI6 agent Hamilton gets killed. He's watching the funeral procession, and he turns and said, "Whose funeral is it?" And the henchman just says, "Yours," and then stabs him. It's a nice little line there, I thought.
Yeah, definitely. And in this one, I thought it was a good quote, but the whole film has like racial undertones, a bit of racism in it. So this is between Bond and Strutter, who works for Felix. So Strutter, kind of obvious you weren't coming out front, not even with that clever disguise you were wearing. And then Bond goes, "Hmm?" And then Strutter goes, "Whiteface in Harlem? Good thinking, Bond."
You're right in terms of that kind of racial undertone, but a little bit of a funny there. Let's move on. Let's pick up on a couple of things around the book versus the movie and where there are some differences. So the book is actually the second James Bond novel in the series, whereas obviously this is film number 8 in the franchise. And in the book, Mr. Big's operation involves gold coins for the 1600s. In the film, the operation is based on heroin. So very different takes on Mr. Big's operation there.
Yeah, and I mentioned this next point, obviously. So in the book, Quarrel Senior was introduced, However, as you know, in episode 1, Quarrel is introduced in the first movie of Doctor No, and I think that's why they did that little linkage, Andy, I mentioned earlier, where it's not explicitly stated in the film, but Quarrel Jr. is kind of related to Quarrel Sr. And in the novel, Felix Leiter has a bigger part, and he's actually fed to a shark and loses half a leg and arm in this novel. But obviously in the films, that happens later on. Spoiler alert.
Very interesting. Jay, do you want to hear a joke?
I always want to hear a joke, Andy. Is it about James Bond?
It is, of course, about James Bond. I wrote 0 jokes about James Bond, so I'm going to steal this one from someone else. If you don't like it, you know who not to blame. So a receptionist, I don't know whether, let's say they're in a hotel. A receptionist asks 007 his name. He replies, Bond, James Bond. And the receptionist replies, I didn't ask for your middle name, Bond.
I like I say some of these to my wife as well. And some of them she just rolls her eyes. But I think that was a nice little joke, Andy. So well done. Thank you.
I think that would be an eye roller, but in a good way. I like that, the silliness of it.
We've obviously only been doing a joke for a few weeks, but if there's any listeners that have a James Bond joke, feel free to tweet us and we can always include it on a future episode if it makes the cut of Andy's high threshold of quality jokes. So carrying on now, Andy, this is where the pressure is on you now. So this is the quiz. So this is the one where I'm going to throw a couple of full statements Andy's way, and then there's going to be 2 statements that are correct. Andy, kind of a spoiler alert, I've dropped my granddad from these statements now. I've retired him now. Not like how James Bond retires people. I've just retired him from this section.
That is interesting because in this film, we don't get Blofeld or Spectre. And now we're not getting your granddad. And I don't think I've ever seen your granddad and Blofeld in the same place at the same time. And I've mentioned how your granddad is a notorious liar and obvious villain. And I'm just putting 2 and 2 together here and coming up with 7, 007 maybe.
Well, Andy, I didn't want to mention it because obviously there's copyright issues. So we can no longer mention my granddad while the copyright issues go through court. So he will be retired for a number of episodes. He might come back when Blofeld returns. Who knows?
We'll refer to him as Nameless Villain.
Nameless Villain, yes. He's not in a wheelchair or balding, just so you know. Anyway, so to state that, I'm going to try to get this right because the last few episodes, when I've said correct, incorrect, it's just gone pear-shaped. So, Andy, as usual, there's 4 statements. 2 are correct and 2 are incorrect. So, listeners, feel free to play along as well. So, Andy, as usual, I will read all 4 statements out, and then you can either ask me to repeat them or just go into it. So, the first statement. Though it was his standard issue pistol, Bond does not fire his PPK in this movie. The next one. Tina Turner nearly got the part of Solitaire, but withdrew due to touring commitments. Roger Moore is the only Bond to use a hang glider. And the last statement. This was nearly Steven Spielberg's first movie, having only directed TV episodes or shorts. However, Spielberg was approached by Universal Pictures to direct Jaws after Dick Richards pulled out. So we could have had a very different Bond movie if Spielberg took this, if my statement is correct or incorrect.
Indeed.
So
very, very different shark scenes as well.
Yes. Maybe you got the idea of Jaws from the script from this film and thought, you know what, there's not enough sharks. I'm going to do a film about one shark and just have a lot more of it instead of the end. So how do you want to do this? So,
I mean, I'm now thinking about Jaws, but instead of the Jaws theme, the James Bond theme in the background. But I'm off on a tangent. These are very, very tricky, it has to be said. there isn't one that obviously stands out as being true or false. I think they're all quite plausible. So I'm expecting potentially a low score here. I'm going to go with the first statement, not firing the PPK, as a true statement, because I don't recall much shooting at all from Bond, it has to be said. I know it obviously kills a number of people in various ways. I remember, the ladder and the kick and the car chases, but I don't remember much in the way of just pure gunfire from the PPK. So I'm going to say that that's a true statement, that he doesn't actually fire it in this film.
Okay. Before I take your answer, if it's incorrect or correct, Bond kills one person with a gun, and it's Samedi, Baron Samedi, where I did some research, Andy. So he does only kill one person with a gun, but is it the PPK? Just to kind of throw, there's not so much a spanner, but just to kind of make you doubt whether you should go with your first answer or not.
I'm going to throw another spanner back at you then and say, does that count as a kill, since we see him in the final scene of the film on the front of the train?
It does count for a kill because it's in the numbers.
I'm going to make you redo all your stats.
But yes, so I leave it up to you.
He's a voodoo man. He comes back from the death. Okay.
He has more than 9 lives.
So I'm going to stick with that statement though. I want to say he doesn't use his PPK. So I don't know why he's got it.
Okay. Do you want to know the answer to that one, or do you want to carry on?
I'm going to continue, because I feel like I'm on a roll here. I'm on fire. So that one's definitely true. I think the other one that's definitely true is the third statement about Roger Moore being the only Bond that used a hang glider. I just don't recall. Well, I don't recall anyone using a hang glider. I didn't remember Roger Moore using it in this film until I watched it back. So I don't recall any hang gliding at all. So I'm going to say that statement is true. And Tina Turner as Solitaire, I think, is false. And I think that's because of the earlier statement around United Artists not sanctioning a black actress for the role. And Spielberg, I think, is also false. I think they always had Hamilton in mind for returning to this, would be my guess. So the pistol not fired and Moore being the only hand glider are my guesses at true statements.
Okay, so before I answer or confirm your position, there is one more movie where Bond hand glides, just so you know. But is that a Roger Moore film or not? I know the answer. Do you?
Find out in a future episode.
So, okay. So you happy with those? Do you want to lock them in?
I'm happy. I feel like with these little nuggets of information, you're trying to lead me down the garden path. So I'm going to stick to my guns, my Walter PPKs.
Nice. So Andy, you are 100% correct this week. You are right. So Bond does not fire his PPK in this movie, and Roger Moore is the only Bond, as of this recording, that uses a hang glider. So Moore also uses a hang glider in Moonraker. The Tina Turner nearly got the part of Solitaire, so I made a variation for that because Diana Ross was originally wanted by the screenwriter, but obviously the issues that you just mentioned is one of the reasons why they pulled that. And Spielberg was not involved with this. He obviously released Jaws, I think it was a couple of years after this film was released. But up until this movie, he had only done TV episodes or shorts. I think it was, or I think he might have done one movie actually in 71. But yeah, so I thought that took me 45 minutes to make those 4 questions, Andy. So I'm glad you had a bit of difficulty, but you still got 100% right. So I'm a bit disappointed.
That was good. Yeah, I mean, basically, don't work hard because it's all for nothing is the lesson you should all take from this. But I feel like that's just desserts after the way you've screwed me over these last few weeks and, tried to knock my confidence and ruin my potential Hollywood career. So now things are back on track. It's onwards and upwards for me.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be often, Andy, that you're mentioned in the same breath as Spielberg. So, that is something you can, appreciate. Let's put it on your CV. I think your whatever actors have as a CV. So, Andy, that's the quiz. I think I'm going to start tallying all the quizzes up in terms of how, what your score is, because I think there's only 2 or 3 weeks where you haven't got it right. So I'm going to have to make these a bit harder, I think. We're moving on to the rankings now. So, our regular listeners will know we are tracking a lot of the stuff that we mentioned earlier on each week. So, Andy, you mentioned earlier, so I'm going to pick up one times. So, Andy, you mentioned Live and Let Die, 2 hours, 1 minute. So that is actually the 3rd longest Bond film we've had so far. So it's short by 21 minutes of compared to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And Thunderball was 2 hours, 10 minutes. Kill count, we've got Live and Let Die, 8 kills, as I mentioned earlier. So that comes in straight in at number 5. So 1 below Goldfinger and 1 above the previous film, Diamonds Are Forever. So Roger Moore, after 1 film, he has 8 kills. And then last one from me before Andy takes over. You mentioned this already. He doesn't drink a martini.
Thank you, Jay. So moving on to the introduction of Bond, James Bond. We do get this in the film, and it's actually the longest it's taken so far, so 23 minutes and 10 seconds. So we've heard this introduction in 5 of the 8 films so far. So even the fact that it's not appeared in 3 is still a surprise to me. But of the 5 we've heard it, it's by far the longest time taken to hear it. And then from a hat perspective, there's no throwing of the hat and there's no wearing of the hat. And Felix Leiter does appear. This is his 5th appearance in the Bond franchise, and it's also the 5th different actor to play the part. So David Henderson plays this, plays the part of Felix in this movie.
Yeah, so we move on to Bond girls now. So Live and Let Die, we've had Solitaire, Miss Caruso, and Rosie Carver. So Andy, I'm going to let you go first for this one. Do you tell me where you put these 3 Bond girls, and then I'll go through my ones.
Okay, so it's a bit of a mixed bag, has to be said. So we're now in total up to 31 Bond girls across the 8 films. I've got Solitaire as a very solid number 4. I thought it was a very well played part, very very strong Bond girl in some ways, and also there was a bit of jeopardy in terms of whose side is she really on. Very beautiful Jane Seymour as well, which certainly helps matters. So I've got a slight just above Tiffany Case and just below Teresa DiVincenzo. So number 4 for Solitaire. Now going further down, I've got Rosie Carver in as my 2nd of 3 from this film, but kind of lower mid-table. So I've got her in 19th place out of 31. The word that comes to mind, as we discussed earlier, is a bit ditzy, but a very good part that she played. Didn't see much of her in terms of screen time, but I thought solid but unspectacular effort from Rosie. And then I've got Miss Caruso slightly further down in 23rd place out of 31. And again, screen time is really the main reason for this for me. Is I believe she only appears in the 1 scene, doesn't say much if anything. Spends most of that scene hidden away in the cupboard. Yeah, just a kind of almost a cameo in some regards. So no real effort in terms of making her part of the film. Or you could almost cut her scenes and everything would be fine. So down in 23rd place for Miss Caruso. How does that compare with your rankings, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, Solitaire, I slipped her in at number 6. So just below Tiffany Case, because I really like Tiffany Case. And just 1 above Domino. So Jane Seymour, obviously very attractive, beautiful actress. And her character, yeah, like you said, you didn't quite know. There was a bit where you think she's kind of switched sides again. So I do think she's a strong entry in terms of a Bond girl. Whereas Miss Caruso and Rosie Carver, they were low down. I don't, like you said, Miss Caruso was in the one scene at the beginning. If you went and got some popcorn or something in a cinema, you would have missed her scene and not realised she was in it. Rosie Carver, she was just so ditzy that she actually ranked lower than the female Andy Flintoff from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So that's how much she grated on me in this film. So yeah, the Ruby Bartlett is just above Rosie Carver. So I've got Rosie Carver at 28 and Miss Caruso at 24. For me, some of the films have really strong Bond girls, and then some of them are just really weak. Like Diamonds Are Forever, we've obviously got a strong Tiffany Case, and then plenty Bambi, Thumper, Marie. On mine were all scored lower down. I know you put Plenty O'Toole higher up, but they're just, sometimes there's some of the films you have one stronger Bond girl and then the like 2 or 3 supporting ones, and that is just a theme that's continued in this film.
Yeah, so it's a good observation. It's almost like there needs to be multiple there needs to be multiple girls to enhance that image of Bond being a womanizer, but ultimately there's only one that really matters throughout the film, and I think that's the case here as well. Moving on to the theme song, so Live and Let Die by Paul McCartney and Wings. I've got this straight in at the top. This is, for me, the best Bond song so far. It's a little bit of a change of pace from previous Bond songs. It's more of a rock upbeat song, but I love this song. I think it's an absolute classic, straight in top of the pops for me. How about yourself?
I've put it in at number 3. We obviously have got our own little Spotify playlist that Andy's pulled together for James Bond. I listen to that a lot, Andy, especially when I'm doing, pulling together the notes, doing the research. And then when I do this part of the podcast, I play, the song again, and I think, oh, where does it drop in? But there's a bit, I do like the song, and it's number 3 for a reason. But there's a bit where I just don't like, where it's, I can't remember exactly where it is, but it starts off good, but then it kind of goes off, and I thought, oh, I'm not that bothered. And like I said, I know it's not a Beatles song, but it's not something that really is. I like Bond songs that are more ballads. So, like the Shirley Bassey songs, although there is a couple of songs later on that I do really like, which I will score higher. But yeah, that's where, top 3 is, respectable position. I did like the change of pace. It was like, with Roger Moore coming in, they did something different, a true rock and roll song. So I do like it. I was a bit surprised when I saw yours, if I'm honest, because we've been quite consistent, haven't we, in terms of, we both had, actually, Diamonds Are Forever went in at number 1, but we both had Goldfinger beforehand as our number 1. So our 1 and 2 have always been the same, but now we've got, like you mentioned, that synergy in terms of earlier on, our rankings have changed. So as our theme songs. So leading on now in terms of opening credits, I go first, Andy, on this one. I put it down as number 4. So, this is, good music, upbeat, fast paced, the colourful, like with a lot of the other films, it's influenced by the subject matter in terms of the main film. So we've got voodoo ceremonies in there, and we've got your usual female silhouettes. But for me, they're all getting a bit samey, so it's hard to distinguish between them now. So I put it in at number 4 just because it's not doing anything different. So Goldfinger's still my number 1 because the gold ladies, the projection on the models of the previous films, all that was new. So it's kind of like setting breaking new territory. And same with Her Majesty's Secret Service. I like the bits where it was snapshotting previous bits from the other bits. You had Honey Rider, Dr. No. So I liked all those kind of different intros, whereas Live and Let Die. Even though the music's different, everything else still feels the same.
That is an interesting point, yeah, and it is difficult to differentiate at times because there's a definite theme in terms of how the opening credits are laid out. Now, for me, I've put this in at number 1 again, and I think the reason I've done that is how it not only interacts with the music, but how it sets the scene for the rest of the film. And I think previously I'd had Thunderball in at number 1, and I think if we think about the swimming and the scuba diving and the harpoon guns and the water of the intro, and a lot of the film was set in the water. And similarly for Goldfinger, we've got lots of gold influence and the gold models, and we've got obviously a film about gold. So it fits. I think it fits quite nicely. Whereas I think some of the others are more sort of generic credits in that style. This, for me, most closely matched the film, and I think that's why I've ranked it slightly above everything else in at number 1.
Fair comments, Andy. And it's nice that we're getting, I know our villains are different, but it's nice we're kind of seeing some differences now in our rankings, which we're going to see, aren't we? When we get to the end of episode 25, I was dreading that we had the similar. It's nice to get some different views, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk villains next. So we've got Baron Samedi, we've got Dr. Kananga, Mr. Big, and we've got T.H. Johnson as the 3/4. Although we know, obviously, we find out 4 becomes 3 because Dr. Kananga and Mr. Big are one and the same. Which takes us the total villains up to 20 for the series so far. So in terms of where they slot for me, all very similar placings. So they're all kind of mid-table-ish. So I'll go reverse order. T.H. Johnson I thought was the weaker of the 3, but I still got him at 14, so just slightly below Rosa Klebb. A good villain, but again didn't really do much other than smile and crush things. So not a great deal of substance, I thought. I think we're gonna differ. I've just eyeballed your rankings, and we've definitely got a difference here. So I've got Dr. Kananga, Mr. Big in at number 11 next. Again, quite a solid villain, but not as imposing, I would say. More somewhat in the background. So I've kind of put him on a par with Dr. No, really, just slightly below. And then my favorite of the 3 is Baron Samedi, which I've got in at number 7. So between the Blofelds of Diamonds Are Forever in 6 and On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 8. I would say that the difference with this for me is there's some element of physical imposingness in the way that Telly Savalas played Blofeld, but it's more that kind of psychological, that voodoo aspect, and it's almost, dare I say, a cool factor. He's quite a cool villain, and I think that for me just edges him up a few places. I see your rankings are quite different, so I'll let you explain your thoughts next.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you were just saying about, Baron Samedi, I was thinking then, and then you mentioned that. So I put in Baron. So out of the 3 villains, henchmen, Andy's mentioned, Baron is actually the lowest. I put him in my ranking. So a number 14 compared to Andy's 7. And when you were saying, justifying your position, I did it like the other way. So where you say like imposing, I was just thinking in the film, he's obviously spooky. And there's a bit where where Solitaire passes the test, and then the Baron kind of is like hovering over her, isn't he? So it's kind of like intimidating, but more of a spooky way. And obviously you got the voodoo bits, the ceremonies, but physically, I don't think he's imposing at all in terms of like, if he was in a fight against Bond. So that's why I put him lower than T.H. Johnson, who goes in at number 13. So only one place higher. But with my rankings, I thought generally that the 3 villains / henchmen were weak compared to previous films. So Dr. Kananga and Mr. Big, I'll put him in at number 11. So my ones have gone 11, 13, and 14. So all mid to slightly lower half. And Andy, I know I can't remember if I said this in a previous episode. Now we've moved away from Spectra. So I know we obviously had Goldfinger and Objob who didn't work for Spectra. Now we've moved away from Spectra. I don't know how these are going to play out, because I find kind of independent villains less intimidating compared to the ones that kind of fall under the Spectra banner. So it'd be interesting to see, once we carry on watching, these next few, because, as you said, and we said in the previous one, we don't see Spectra for a while, where these kind of independent villains drop into our rankings. The exception so far is obviously Goldfinger, who have both got us in at number 1, is my view. So next one, Andy, is movies. So, we both said what our score is at the beginning. So I said 6 out of 10. So, we have got these on our website as well in terms of tracking these. So 6 out of 10 is on par in my rankings with You Only Live Twice. And I think Live and Let Die was slightly better than You Only Live Twice. So they both got 6 out of 10, but I think it was slightly better. It was refreshing seeing Roger Moore coming in, playing the role different, as we've described earlier in the podcast. It is a better film than Diamonds Are Forever, and I think it's slightly better than You Only Live Twice. But for me, the next one up is Dr. No, which is 7 out of 10 in 5th place. So I don't think it is as good as Dr. No. So I put Live and Let Die in at number 6 with 6 out of 10. How about you, Andy?
So I've got it as 8 out of 10, which puts it as second best so far. Only Goldfinger beats this for me. And I think when I look back and think of Bond generally and how I rank the Roger Moore films, or how I think of the Roger Moore films, I think rewatching this, I was pleasantly surprised with just how much I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it far more than I expected to. And it was just really captivating and engrossing, more so than the recent Connery ones. So, only Goldfinger, which still stands head and shoulders for me above, but this is my first 8 out of 10 ranking. It got pretty close. So, yes, second best so far. Very, very strong opening for Roger Moore, I thought.
Yeah, it's nice. Like we kind of just said, we're seeing a bit of a difference now. I'm trying to think now of the villains, Andy, because obviously, you mentioned that the book was focusing on 16th century, 1600s gold, whereas this is purely about drug money, isn't it? Whereas, the Spectre ones was either threat of nuclear war or some kind of domination. Goldfinger was obviously gold bullions, wasn't it? Whereas this one seems to be more seedy, sleazy kind of focus, in terms of heroin, money, kind of drug trafficking is the plot around this one.
Yeah, in some ways that makes it a little bit more straightforward. In some ways it can kind of de-emphasize the importance. So there's not that world domination element. I guess the only thing that kind of saves it from just being a straight up all about money is the fact that he wants to give away a whole bunch of heroin to get people hooked. But ultimately that's a long-term business plan. Get people hooked so they then have to buy it. It's a bit of an elaborate try before you buy scheme by Big. But you're right, it seems less. It's almost like you don't need a spy for this. You just need the police.
Yeah,
and not that Bond is worthless and useless in this film, because it isn't by any means. But it isn't your typical spy film.
Yeah, and Bond only gets involved because MI6 have 3 agents murdered, don't they? Assassinated. The UK rep and the UN as well. So Bond might have not get involved if none of that transpired.
Yeah, that is a good point. So, but it's certainly taking it off in a very different direction. Yeah,
so we move on to Bond actors, and it's hard to judge, isn't it, Andy, with just one Roger Moore film, but George Lazenby only had one. So In terms of the three actors that we've played, that have played James Bond so far, Roger Moore I've slotted in at number 2. He plays him differently to Sean Connery, and differently to how George Lazenby played him as well.
I agree with you in terms of the overall Bond rankings. Connery then more than Lazenby so far. Will give more of a chance over the next 6 films to see if he can change that position. What I would say as a bit of a side note is arguably this is the strongest debut of Bond. I think obviously Lazenby only had the one film to judge him against, and I think Roger Moore was much stronger in the role than Lazenby was. I think if we were to judge just this film on Her Majesty's Secret Service and Doctor No, if we take away all the other Connerys, it'd be interesting to see who we think had the strongest debut. And I would argue that maybe Roger Moore slightly edges it in that regard, but Connery comes more into his own, particularly in From Russia with Love and Goldfinger, and that's what puts him in the number 1 slot when he really kind of finds his groove. It's
an interesting point, but then if you look at our movie rankings on Her Majesty's Secret Service, I've given that 8 out of 10, whereas Live and Let Die is 6 out of 10. So for me, and Dr. No is Sean Connery's first, which is 7 out of 10. So for me, it's the weakest first entry, but obviously I've ranked Roger Moore as a better Bond as George Lazenby, just because we both said we liked George Lazenby, and we both said it's a shame he didn't do more films. It was good, but I thought it was refreshing, go in a different direction in terms of like the smoothness and the the tender lover kind of thing. Whereas obviously Connery is different, but we kind of spoke about it, didn't we, before we went live, about where Live and Let Die dropped in, because me and the missus both enjoyed it, but like I said earlier, when you pull it side by side, each of them, it was just lower than Doctor No, and only slightly better with Only Live Twice. But then thinking, is that just because of the the villains? I didn't rate them as highly. If there were better villains, could that film scored higher? It's just some what ifs, really. You can only obviously work with what you've given, and I just remember that from memory, in terms of when I watched these originally and rewatched them through the years before, like I said before, I've not rewatched a Bond film for about 10, 15 years. I just remember the Moore films not being as great.
Yeah, I'd agree with that assessment. And I think that's what took me by surprise this time, is that I wasn't expecting it to be so good. But let's see if that continues over the next few weeks.
And I can't remember Live and Let Die is one of his better ones or weaker ones. So, you've obviously scored it higher, but are they all going to be that high in terms of rewatching them? Whereas I've scored it lower. Is that because I think other Roger Moore films are better? It's just obviously we've gone in such a different end, haven't we? So it'd be interesting to see when we go through the Mum ones, if you're, and the Moore Bonds, whether you're going to be, where I've consistently scored, being more generous with the Connery ones. Is it going to be like vice versa now through the Moore ones? Be interesting to see.
We shall find out over the coming weeks. So I think that brings us to a close for this week's episode. Thank you everyone for listening, and give you a little preview of what we've got in store next week. So in the past we've had a gold finger, and in the future we're going to have a golden eye. This film could be called Gold Penis, because he is the man with the golden gun.
I like it, Andy. On that note.
Yeah, I've lowered the tone sufficiently enough. Let's leave it there.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels. And be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
reading room. The reading room. The reading room. The reading room.
Hello, Christopher. What insanity are you up to today?
Oh, hey, Lydia. I'm downloading some movies.
What? People are always telling me that's illegal.
Not these. They're all public domain. Oh, look, Rescue from Gilligan's Island.
Well, let me see what you're doing. Oh, you're at archive.org. Well, they have thousands of films, TV shows, commercials, radio shows, and books available.
Yeah, but there are so many. I wish there was a podcast or something that would discuss these things. Give us an idea of what's worth the time.
Christopher, there is. We do one.
Oh, that's right. We host Orphan Entertainment. Once a month, we pick something and review and discuss it. That sure is nice of us.
Sure. Why don't you click over to Orphan Entertainment and remind yourself a little more about the show?
Oh, will do. Let's see, that's at orphanentertainment.com. And yeah, it looks like we're available on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Oh, hey, can we review the Gilligan's Island movie someday?
We'll see, Christopher. We'll see.